The second workshop, with a very different style, is working a little bit later at Saint-Pierre, at Moissac. And they're working on the south portal. And this is from about 1115 to 1130. And the main image that we talk about, although we'll be talking about some other images, is the tympanum. The tympanum, of course, is this lunette over the doorway, the half circle over the doorway. And the subject is the apocalypse. It's sometimes just called a majesty of the Lord, or Christ in majesty. But the details of it come from the book of Revelation. And so this is the apocalyptic Christ, as it were. And we're also going to look at some of the sculpture on the Trumeau and on the jambs, which are very unusual jambs, as you'll see. They're actually, well, here you can see, they're kind of scalloped, having these pointed curves on the edge of the doorway. And of course, here is a diagram showing you the different parts. The Trumeau is the doorpost. The jambs are on either side of the door. The tympana is the half circle over the door. The voussoirs are the wedge-shaped blocks that make up the arch. And you can see how that corresponds to the south portal at Moissac. Okay, here we're looking at the tympana of the apocalyptic Christ in majesty. And as you can see, we have the figures within the tympana and a lot of decorative carving in the lintel, these circles with the rosettes, different designs in them below, and foliage in the archivolts. Closer, and we see that the large figure in the center, raised up at the top, and of course it's the largest figure because he's the most important figure. We've talked about hierarchy in the Middle Ages and how everything is a hierarchy, whether it is the king and the lords and the serfs, or whether it's the church, where you have, let's say at a monastery, your abbot is at the top of the hierarchy, and the monks are sworn to obey him, or the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and then archbishops and bishops, and you go on down to the clergy at the base, as it were. So hierarchy is very important for the Middle Ages, and it's represented in the works of art. Christ is usually the largest central figure. He is in heaven. He is enthroned, and he's frontal in that he's looking out at us. These heads are often separate blocks that have been set in, and that's what it looks like here. Then look down below, and you'll see these smaller figures. These are the elders of the apocalypse, and they also extend up on the sides where the tympanum is curving down. So let's look a little closer at some of these details. Here we see the one on the throne. Now, he's identified as Christ here because he has the nimmed halo, the halo with the cross in it. But if you've read the book of Revelation, it talks about the one enthroned in heaven, seated on the throne, and surrounded by the four living creatures, the creatures that we have come to know as the symbols of the four evangelists. And these four living creatures, the winged man, the winged lion, the winged ox, and the eagle, sing Sanctus, 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 holy, holy, holy. And so the one is generally identified as God. But because he has the nimmed halo, we think of this as a Christ figure. So you could think about it as the three in one, but in some way it does embody Christ, not just God the Father. And here we see the head from the side, how it projects out a bit. And you can see the linearity of the curving beard. The hairs are parallel lines, and then the beard curls around in these little spirals at the end. And you can also see a lot of the detailed carving. You can see these sort of roundels with rosettes in them. Within the halo, you can see stars within the mandorla. And you can see the carving that would be, embroidery or a jeweled border on the around the neck of Christ. And you'll see it in other places on the other figures as well. Here we see Christ holding the book, and once again you can see the detailed patterns, which could imitate, in a sense, be embroidery or possibly sometimes gemstones. Some of them look like they could be, you think back to our reliquaries, you see these kind of raised surfaces that could be imagined as jewels within the embroidery of the robe of God. Now remember, this was all painted. So all of these things would be picked out in color, and that would make it easier to see details from the ground. It's sometimes hard to make them out in black and white photographs. So I wanted to show you details, something very up close and personal, as it were. And I tell you, always look at the drapery folds. They tell you so much about the artists. Here you see a number of different types of drapery folds. You'll notice going across the torso of God or of Christ. That kind of plate. It's a wide band, and it almost reminds you of, I want to say, armadillo plates that goes around the torso. And then there are the parallel curving lines with ridges in them, which you see here over the knee and over the arm. And then you see this fluttering, very active hemline with all the intricacy of it's almost like pleats or folds that are not just regular. They seem to move. And here we have some details of the Evangelist symbols. And once again, these are twisting around. It gives you this active, energetic, agitated feeling. It's very different than the plaque style of Gelduinus, which was relatively static. Here you have an artist who is really giving you something very expressive and active, and you're going to see this in other Romanesque tympana as well. You know, some of these figures are turning around. You see how the eagle is turning back, facing one way and twisting around. And so here you see the lion. Maybe it'd be hard to identify him as a lion. Obviously, the artist has never seen a lion. How would he? But this beast that is supposedly the lion and the winged ox, which form these almost curving right angles, and they twisting around. And this just gives it more of this feeling of energy. The excitement of Christ on his throne, or God on his throne. You also have the 24 elders of the Apocalypse, and this is what really marks it as an apocalyptic scene. Now, the Apocalypse is the last book of the Bible. It's known as the Book of Revelation. And in it, St. John, the Evangelist, has a vision, and he has a vision of God on his throne, the one on his throne. And we've talked about some of the apocalyptic details. And among this is around the throne of God are the 24 elders of the Apocalypse. And at one point, they take their crowns and they cast them on the crystal sea. Well, here we see them still wearing their crowns. They haven't cast them off. Some of them are actually holding musical instruments. I guess they could accompany the Sanctus. And in the details, because we're going to look up a little closer to this, once again, you can see how interesting the carving is, how you have the intricate patterns and banding on the garments around the hem of the overgarment or the neckline and other places. And you also have that sort of what I'm calling plate drapery that wraps around the body, but is basically a grooves that really kind of remind you of an armadillo plate. It almost looks like they could, pass under one another. Well, they can't, but that's just the impression trying to describe it. And once again, remember, these would all have been painted. You'll notice how the figures now, they are small to fit into the space, but they're much more three-dimensional than the figures that we saw with the plaque style of Galduinus. These are almost like little statues in their own right, only they are still subordinate to their place in the architecture. They fit there. And they're all twisting around once again, which gives you this feeling of energy as they look up to Christ or look up to the One. And just here's some of them on the side. Well, let's go a little lower down and look at the, here we see the lintel with this decorative pattern, the Trumeau, and the jambs, and there is carving on both the Trumeau and the jambs, a figural carving as well. On the front of the Trumeau, you have these lions, which are, once again, very stylized, very abstract lions. I have to admit, I think Romanesque lions are some of the most interesting beasties in the medieval bestiary of art. So we have these crisscrossing lions. And, people talk about, are they symbolic? Do they derive in some way from the interlaces? They're certainly not interlaced. They're just simply crisscrossing. Do they stand for power, for majesty, for something ferocious and evil? You find lions in a lot of doorways, maybe guarding the doorway. And then, as you look on the side, you see stretched out, very, very tall and slender, is a prophet, which I've seen some people identify as Jeremiah, but, I don't know if that's certain, because there's no real inscription or attribute to tell us. You notice he's that long, thin, cross-legged figure, to give us this feeling of moving, and he's so twisting around, fitting within the shape. And here we see a close-up of those lions and the wonderful little curlicue at the end of each tuft of hair. Does that does remind me of the way in the Ectornaut Gospels, of the Hiberno-Saxon manuscript, that the lion was shown with the little curlicues at the end. So this love of decorative patterning is something that you will see throughout the Romanesque period. And then we're going to look closer at our prophet. And you can see he has this really sensitive face with these ovoid eyes carved very finely, and very crisp carving of the grooves in the parallel grooves in the beard and hair. So once again, pattern suggesting hair. He's clutching his scroll of his prophecy in his hand. And as we said, he's twisting around, gives you some action, even though he is confined and subordinate to the space of the door jamb. And here we have another detail looking straight at his face. Now, those door jambs that have a scalloped edge, they also look kind of ferocious, don't they? They come out with points, also have figures. And so here is another figure. If that one was Jeremiah, then this one might be Isaiah, or maybe it's the opposite way around. But another figure fitting into the space that is left, tall, thin, and with these kind of tubular limbs, and his holding his scroll, so we know he's a prophet. And then on the other side, we have the titular saint of the church, Saint Pierre, or Saint Peter. And of course, Saint Peter is easily recognized because he has his keys. Christ says to Peter, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." And so here he's holding his keys. And once again, he is fitting into the space that is left. So he is tall, slender, tubular, and kind of hunched over with his head extending out, which probably would help you to see the face, even though it looks like, a very interesting distortion. Remember that Romanesque sculpture is abstract in one way or another. Certainly the figures are recognizable as figures, but they are stretched out, or they are patterned, or they are twisted to fit in the space. And now we're going to look at the wall that is at right angles to the portal. And as you can see, there are two arches with two levels of scenes within the arches, and then a band or a kind of frieze of figures above, which tell another story. Now, on this side, the west wall of the south portal, you have a kind of moral allegory, and it shows you the parable of Lazarus. Now, this is not Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, who was resurrected from the dead. This is another parable of Christ in which he talks about the poor man, Lazarus, and the rich man, Dives. And then we see that scene in the frieze above and the top level under the arches. And then down below, there are figures that are presumably personifications of sin. Some people call them devils. One side is very worn. We'll take a look at the other side. Here in the frieze at the top, we see Lazarus. He is the poor man. He is starving. He is begging at the house of the rich man for food. And the rich man, whose name is Dives, is feasting while Lazarus starves. And the Bible says that Lazarus is covered with sores, and you can see there's kind of little nodules on his legs, and the dogs lick his sores here as he is dying. But when he dies, Lazarus was taken up to heaven. And you can see here is this angel who presumably was holding something that represented the soul of Lazarus, a little figure perhaps, but the arms are broken off. So he's standing right above the dying Lazarus with his arms outstretched. And then to the left, we see presumably a prophet in heaven on the far left, and another bearded figure, which is representing Abraham, and the idea that Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. In other words, he's been brought to heaven. So Lazarus is dying while Dives feasts and doesn't even, won't even give him a crust of bread to save his life. And then below the arches, we see what happens to Dives. We saw what happened to Lazarus up above. On our right, as we look at it, is the death of Dives. He's lying in this very elaborate bed, very different than Lazarus just, above, who's just lying on the ground. And presumably his wife is weeping here at the side of his bed, and he has blankets or bed coverings of some kind. But the devils are waiting for him. One is holding this money bag in his hand, like, hey, you can't take it with you. It's not going to help you after you're dead. And as he gives up his soul, the devils grab it. And then on the other side, which as you can see is worn, so it's a little hard to make things out, but this is Dives in hell, where he is being tormented by devils. And then down below, we see these tall, slender figures, once again fitting into the shape. And as you can see, they've been outside for a while. They've been damaged and they are worn. The one is evidently seems to be a female figure with pendulous breasts and wearing a cloak. And this figure is often identified as Luxuria, which means not only luxury, but also has the connotation of lust. And then the figure next to him has been identified either as a devil or as avarice, greed, which is certainly, these would be the prevailing sins of Dives. He's so greedy, he won't even give away food for a starving man. And presumably along with that greed goes luxury. He lives in the life of luxury, and sometimes luxury leads to lust, although that's not really, that part isn't in the story of Dives. On the other side, on the east wall of the south portal, we see the Virgin Mary and the infancy of Christ. These are stories of the infancy, the babyhood of Christ, really beginning at conception. And down at the bottom, you can see on the left, the Annunciation. Now, the Annunciation is when the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she will bear the Christ child. And according to Christian theology, when Mary gives permission, when she says, behold the handmaid of the Lord, this is the moment when the Holy Spirit enters Mary and impregnates her, and when Christ first takes on mortal flesh in the womb of Mary, the moment of the incarnation. So we see that moment here on the left, the two tall, slender figures, and then two other tall, slender figures. And this is the visitation. It is when Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, and Mary is pregnant with the Christ child. Her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist, and John the Baptist acknowledges Christ even in their womb. And this is also the moment when Mary sings the Magnificat, one of the canticles of the church. My soul doth magnify the Lord. And then up above, the Christ child has already been born, and we're seeing under the arches the adoration of the Magi. And as you can see, the Magi are on one side underneath the arch, and they look like they're almost, I want to say, tripping along. One of them is taller to fit the space. But they're active, their knees are bent to show that they're moving in the direction of the Christ child. And then here is Mary, sort of enthroned on what could be a very large throne or probably a bed, with the Christ child, quite large, on her lap, reaching out toward the Magi. And then above that, we see the presentation in the temple on the right, and the flight into Egypt. Mary and Christ and Joseph are fleeing Herod's soldiers who have heard the prophecy that a king will be born, and he wants to make sure that no one deposes him, so he's killing all of the male children under 2 years old. So they are fleeing into Egypt, where they'll be safe. And you might notice that the cities in Egypt are represented with a little town, a little medieval-looking town. And these statues are falling off their pedestals. There is a story in the apocryphal gospel that's called the Gospel of St. James, or the Proto-Evangelium. And it says that when Mary and Joseph and Jesus got to Egypt, and here is Jesus, God incarnate, according to Christian theology, enters Egypt. All of the idols of those false gods just fall right off their pedestal. It's a miracle.